free app. Stream all of our live local shows, including Solomon on Blast and the Jim Parisi Show and the Jake Feinberg Show. And we appreciate you taking the time today to check us out. And without further ado, I want to bring in a friend of the program and a decorated sports journalist, Roy Firestone. Welcome back to the Jake Feinberg Show.
Hi, Jake. How are you?
Oh, it's great to hear your voice, man. How are you?
I'm glad to be here. You know, I also would love if you need to talk about music, a lot about music, jazz, particularly rock and roll in the British invasion era. I'd love to talk about that stuff, but I know we're going to talk a little bit about Rick Barry today, correct?
Yeah, I mean, I just, you gave me that window. I'm be more than happy to stretch it out if you want to, but
Sure.
yeah, let's just get into it. From your perspective, stepping back, do you have any memories of when Rick Barry made his stand when he decided to hold out, leave the NBA to join the ABA?
Of course, sure. First of all, I went to the University of Miami, and of course, so did Rick. He's one of only two players to have their number retired at Miami. All-American. In fact, as you probably know, I don't know if you've mentioned this yet, the only player in the history of basketball to lead the NCAA in scoring, the ABA in scoring, and the NBA in scoring.
Wow.
So when he went to the NBA as a member of the Warriors in the early 70s, I believe, I want to say 70, maybe 69, 70, he was the second pick overall, tremendous player, but and we'll talk about this, he was unhappy, as he usually was on some level as a player almost anywhere he went. He was unhappy with the Warriors underpaying him. The ABA was just forming, and the Oakland Oaks, owned by singer Pat Boone, of all people. By the way, I've talked to Pat Boone about this, and he's got a great memory of the whole ABA experience. But Pat Boone offered him more money. He decided to jump. He was one of the very first players ever who was an established NBA star to go to the ABA. He could have been the most important player early on to jump, and he did. He played. He wanted to play for the Oakland Oaks, which is another Oakland franchise, so it wasn't very far to go. But the courts decided that he needs to stay put for a year, so he had to sit out for a year until they figured out the contract, because it had never been done before. So the first year, as a member of the Oakland Oaks, Rick Barry was the color commentator for the Oakland Oaks for a full season.
Wow.
So he did radio. And remember, the Oakland Oaks didn't draw particularly well. They drew about 2,500 fans a game. So here he is doing broadcast for the Oakland Oaks, and the next year he played for the Oakland Oaks and played brilliantly. Unfortunately, the Oakland Oaks weren't going to last very long because they had attendance issues, and they moved to Washington. And then, of course, he was unhappy going to Washington because he was going from next door to across the country. And to make matters even worse, the Washington Caps franchise in the old ABA was a West Coast franchise, if you can believe it. So in other words, every time they played, they had to play on the West Coast. They had to go all the way across the country for every game. Incredible. So I know it's a long-winded answer, but I do remember what it was like for him to go to the Oakland Oaks. He was an immediate impact player. He was one of the greatest ABA players of all time. Played for the Nets, of course, later. He balked at going to the Virginia Squires. And then he was court-ordered to go back to the Warriors in the early 70s before they won the title, I think 72, 73, and they won the title, I think, in 75.
Talking to Roy Firestone here on the Jake Feinberg Show, and we talked off air a couple weeks ago, and you said that nobody or very few people have the acumen, the basketball IQ that Rick Barry possessed. And I was hoping that you could talk to the audience about a specific time, something that he either shared with you or that you saw. Could you talk about that acumen in a specificity to give the audience an idea of of his court presence and how bright he was?
Well, first of all, Rick Barry is a very complicated individual. I really, truly mean that. He was a guy who, I can't usually use the word misunderstood, Jake, because he was understood by a lot of people. He was not a touchy-feely guy. He wasn't. He was not a lovable guy. He was not somebody who was he was respected, but he was despised by a lot of players. But I'm going to get into that in a little bit later in a few moments, because I also think if there was an area where he was overlooked, if not underrated. It was in his ability to size up what was going on the court. I'll give you some specifics in a second. But Rick Barry was, even though people viewed him as a selfish guy because of the way he talked, he was one of the most unselfish players I've ever been around. He was a team player. In fact, he changed his game several times in professional basketball at stops both in the ABA and then even back to the NBA, where he was not so much an inside player, became an outside shooter and a passer. In fact, he was one of the great court generals I can ever recall in any sport for a player who could score like that. So Rick Barry was always about getting the ball to the right people at the right time. He was a coach many times in his career later, but mostly at a level of the CBA or the American basketball leagues and new leagues and things like that. But he was never a guy utilized properly for his basketball knowledge, and he was deeply knowledgeable about strategy. He was a great color analyst, which we can get into in a few moments. He knew the game up and down better than anybody probably I've ever known, had better court sense even than Magic Johnson, in my opinion. But the problem is, and it was the tragic flaw of him for Rick Barry, was he had a personality issue because he just couldn't stand mediocrity or the lack of preparation or the lack of execution. And he told people that.
Right.
And because of that, he alienated teammates and coaches, everybody. It seems like very few people will stand up and say, I really love the guy. Very few. But I think he was a lot more complicated than he was a bad guy. He had a bad attitude. It's just too much more complicated.
Roy, you're waxing poetic here. Let's, because it's too simplistic to say that he was a bad guy. He was a perfectionist.
Correct.
And he pushed himself to these standards and didn't have any tolerance or sympathy for anybody who didn't rise to that level. What made him, or in your mind, what were the factors that made him a complicated? Was he a genius? And can you talk about his complications?
Yeah. Well, let me give you a perfect example and a comparison. And he was a lot more beloved, but he was about the same kind of player, and that's Kobe Bryant. Kobe Bryant had a ton of enemies. Kobe Bryant had a lot of people that he played with couldn't stand him. Dwight Howard was one. But you put Kobe Bryant and Rick Barry on the same court, I promise you they would have gotten along. Because both understood that they had to do it the right way. And Rick Barry had a difficult time with his personality and literally physically the looks on his face, the smirks, the rolling of the eyes, the arrogance, the perceived arrogance. But, I'm going to say something on this show now. If you ever have Rick Barry on, you can play it back. Rick Barry was one of the finest all-around people I've ever known in the game in terms of the on-court presence. He knew the game. He was an enormously talented scorer. He could shoot like nobody's business. He was the best foul shooter in the history of the game. He had an over 900% success rate in his foul shooting. Imagine that today, by the way.
Right.
But his tragic flaw was he didn't know how to be tactful. He did not know how to treat people because he was so angered by mediocrity and poor execution that he had no filter, just like Kobe Bryant. Very similar players in that way.
Wow, this is so. Can you talk about did cats like Jerry West and Julius Erving, did they respect Rick or did they like him? Well,
Jerry West, he works with Rick right now, or sees Rick a lot because Rick works in radio in the Warriors broadcasts, so he sees him a lot. I think, ironically, maybe not to the same extent, but I think Jerry West is also a similar player, but harder on himself than he was on other players. Jerry West had no patience for mediocrity and poor play, so Jerry West would be hard to think that he hated Rick Barry. He might not have liked him, but I think he would have respected him. However, people like Julius Erving and maybe Barkley, I'm sure it wouldn't have worked real well because Rick was difficult in terms of how he talked to people. Although Barkley was also tough on people too. Julius less so. I just think that in an era of players like LeBron, who pretty much take it on their shoulders to win the games when they have to win on his own, he can do it. Rick could do that too. But Rick was much more, interestingly enough, a team-oriented player, and if he didn't get the kind of output from his team that he thought was indicated, he would absolutely look around and say, I do not want to be part of this whole package here. And he would protest it. He would tell people to their face. He'd get into shouting matches inside locker rooms. So the two players you mentioned, Jerry West, and I think you said Julius Erving.
Yes.
I don't think that he was their cup of tea. But I'm telling you, the irony of all of this is Rick Barry would have been a hell of a coach. But the problem is he wasn't a people person, never had the ability to be a people person. So and I think it did come from part of it his childhood. His father-in-law at one point was the coach at Miami and the Oakland Oaks.
Bruce Hale,
way.
That's right. Yeah.
Bruce Hale. So basketball was everything in his life. 4 of his 5 kids played professional basketball. 4. That's astonishing if you think about it.
Well, that's I want to. This is really important, though. I mean, can you talk about specifically how Rick Barry innovated the game of basketball?
Mm-hmm.
Innovated the game of basketball.
Well, he was the first. He was the first point forward, essentially,
right.
Before Magic Johnson. Or some people look at Magic Johnson as the power guard, so to speak, because he was 6'9". He could play guard, he could play forward. But Rick Barry was like that too. Rick Barry was a prolific scorer who could shoot one of the greatest shooters ever, right up there with Larry Bird. An amazing shooter, 3-point, you name it. But he changed his game, and he became an assist guy, a rebound guy, and not so much in the paint. He'd go out and dictate the court. He would be a court general, especially late in his career, in the late period with the Rockets, and before that a little bit with the Warriors themselves. Al Attles, who was later to be the coach of the Warriors, didn't like him. He didn't talk for years with Al Attles. Butch Beard didn't talk to him. Jamal Wilkes didn't talk to him. However, there were some players that loved him, and but never publicly said so, that got along great with him. But they were few and far between. And I just think that Rick was a guy who was way ahead of his time, innovative. He changed the position, the forward position. It wasn't just a big, tall guy. He could shoot, he could move the ball up the court, and he knew how to handle the basketball. Brilliant guy. Probably one of the most brilliant players in terms of intellect, the game intellect of anybody I've ever known.
Did you? I've watched some interviews with him going back to the mid '70s, and he is always talking about feeling hurt by the criticism, and always wanting to be liked. And he reminds me of this person who is literally sort of has the ability to sort of put off everybody in the room, but yet he's still running after them, saying, "Please be my friend." What was that? How do you explain? I mean, how do you rationalize that situation when you have? I know this speaks to the complication, but it's like you have a guy who has huge expectations of himself and his teammates, has no way of really giving positive leadership. He criticizes, but yet he still wants to be loved. I mean, can you riff on that?
Sure. Well, first of all, this is important. It's so ironic because today, radio and TV reward people with opinions, and the more pointed the opinions are and the more incendiary, if you will, opinions there are, the more you get a job. Rick's doing radio in San Francisco, and every single day he's ripping on people and supporting a few, but mostly not. Mostly they're criticisms. You get rewarded now to being a critic. Back in the 60s and 70s, it was the last thing people wanted. It was unprofessional to be critical, either as a player or even a broadcaster. He's both. So he inherent to Rick Barry was a critic. He was really hard on himself. really hard. I used to know his brother. We sat together at the ABA games in Miami with the Miami Floridians. When Rick would ever come down, the brother would be ripping on Rick. So Rick was murder on himself.
Wow.
But the other thing is that if you look at the overall scheme of, I don't really think he's a true narcissist, but I think there were some elements to him that where he'd walk into a room and he would just sort of take over because his opinion mattered more than most people because he knew more, but he did not know how to be warm and friendly. You know, I think he's been married 3 times, and while that's not an indictment, listen, people make mistakes in life. It does speak to the fact that the interpersonal relationship issues, even with his own kids, there was periods of time, and I don't know if it's still open-ended now, that at least 2 of his kids never spoke to him, even after they made it big into the pros. I know John Barry was one of them. And John Barry is a broadcaster, and a good one of the best. But they did not like the way his father, all the boys pretty much, did not like the way the father talked to them and acted towards them and felt, he needed to say stuff. He just didn't have the ability. He was never not just a warm and fuzzy guy, but he was so direct and so excruciatingly hard on both himself and others that it just was lost after a while in the translation. It was worse than a Bobby Knight because, Bobby Knight had a lot of qualities to him that players really did like and really loved. But Rick didn't have the other side. He just didn't have the other side. And he tried, and he kept making the same mistakes over and over again, but he was not ever going to be a guy that was going to be regarded as, that's just Rick. We all love him, but, he's just being Rick. He was never that guy. They just said they couldn't stand him. And that's too bad because I think if he could, he's 72 years old now, if he could do it all over again, if he could try, if he could do it differently, and he knew how to talk to people, I think he would have been better received. But make no mistake, we're talking about certainly one of the top 15 players of all time, but I can make an argument that he's one of the great forwards, if not in the top 3 greatest forwards of all time. This guy was the complete deal.
No, I mean, Roy, you're just doing. I love talking to you, man. Why would you want to see a documentary on Rick Barry?
Because I think it's about excellence. I'm always fascinated by excellence. I've met and talked to literally thousands of people about that subject, and very few people were as controversial in the pursuit of excellence. Certainly, Bob Knight was one. I think Rick Barry certainly was one. There were people who were just so overwhelmingly hard. I mean, I think you could make an argument that Popovich is sort of like a little bit like Rick Barry. Some of the players love him privately, but publicly they can't stand him because he's always ornery and angry. I think Nick Saban could be somebody like that. But Rick didn't have any of that tact. He just didn't have the ability to be tactful and talk to people in a manner, especially in this day and age where players who don't have to put up with it because they're making tens of millions of dollars, and they could say, screw you, the hell with you, I'm going to do my own way. I'm getting paid. It wasn't that way in the 70s. All he cared about was winning. All he ever cared about was winning.
Can you share a personal story between you and Rick? I mean, did he come on? Did he come on your show? And
many times.
Talk
many
about a seminal conversation or a time when you had him when you opened him up.
I think, first of all, Rick came on several times. He was somewhat of an analyst for us for our show. He must have been on 10 times over the years. I think this is going to sound strange after all I've just said about him. I think that I really saw a side of Rick that he didn't show a lot of people because he cared. He cared. I made him laugh a lot, and he was a guy who could laugh, and he loved to tell stories. He had some personal favorites in his game, in the sport. But when he came on my show, he would talk about how how he really worried about his relationship with his boys and his relationship with women more than even basketball. I remember I'll never forget this. He got emotional, and people always do the cliche with me about making them cry, which is, we'll do another show about that.
We will, yeah. No, who cares? Yeah, I mean,
and by the way, I'm not ashamed of it or unproud of it, but it's such a cliche. I mean, I did 5,000 shows. You might have had 20 people cry. That's below, I think, the level, but that's what people remember. Anyway, Rick came on our show, and he was talking about his marriage that was falling apart, literally on the show, that he was separated, and his eyes got all filled up, and he says it's really something when you know somebody loves you that you can't find a way to show that love back. And I remember something like that, and it was a relatively new marriage that was falling apart again. So I think he felt wounded by all of it, and that's something I'll never forget. And he's also been involved in a lot of projects. He's had shoe deals, and he's had orthopedic type of shoe deals. He's also had, sweaters. I think he worked with. He's had like clothing lines. You name it. He's tried a lot of things. He should have been. He could have been loved. He'll never be the loved person, certainly, that anybody would want in life. Everybody wants to be loved, of course, ultimately. And I don't think that he had the ability to get love back because he couldn't show love. He really couldn't. He had a tough time with it.
Roy, let's do a full hour in either later this month or in October. We can go over a myriad of things, including a lot of music. Okay. And I really thank you for helping me build this foundation for Rick Barry. I hope we can get some momentum from this, and have a beautiful day, brother.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jake, and I'll talk to you next month, perhaps.
Definitely. All right, man. Be good.
Bye-bye.
Bye. We'll be right back with Billy Ryan on the Jake Feinberg Show.